They did not simply believe that I had failed in life. That evening, my family made certain that everyone attending my brother's engagement dinner understood exactly how they saw me. I sat quietly in my chair with a napkin resting across my knees while my father joked about the years I had supposedly wasted. My brother wore a small smirk, and my mother nodded along as if everything being said was undeniable truth. I stayed silent. I offered no defense. Then my brother's fiancée leaned forward slightly and whispered something that made the entire room fall silent. In an instant, the conversation stopped. Even my mother froze where she sat. Before I explain what happened next, take a moment to tap like, leave a comment telling me where you are listening from, and share whether your own family has ever underestimated you. Because that brief silence in that exact moment ended up changing everything. My name is Natalie Brooks, and in my family a name only seemed to matter if it was attached to a title people could proudly mention in conversation. Realtor, broker, investor, anything that sounded reliable, successful, and profitable. My name never came with one of those labels. It drifted around the table like background noise, only acknowledged when someone needed a contrast. The engagement dinner was held in a private room at a restaurant downtown, the kind of place with dark wooden walls and soft lighting, designed to make everyone appear successful. The table was covered with white cloths, heavy silverware sat neatly arranged, and a server moved quietly between guests, refilling glasses before anyone even asked. My parents loved restaurants like this. They believed the room you sat in said more about who you were than anything you could ever explain. I was seated 2 chairs away from my brother, close enough to hear every quiet remark yet far enough to remain outside the center of attention. He looked relaxed and confident, already settling into the role of future patriarch of the family. When people spoke to him, they leaned forward. They laughed a little louder at his comments. My parents watched him with the same look they had carried my entire life whenever they spoke about him. It was a mixture of pride and relief. No one really asked how I was doing. Whenever someone briefly glanced in my direction, my mother filled the silence before I had the chance to respond. She would gently explain that Natalie was still figuring things out, speaking in the careful tone of someone smoothing out a small flaw that only she seemed to notice. My father added remarks about patience and about how some people were simply not built to handle real pressure. They smiled while saying it, as though their words were generous. Instead of reacting, I focused on the small details in front of me. The candle flame flickered softly. The smell of charred steak mixed with pepper hung in the air. From outside the private room came the low hum of voices from the main dining area. Those details grounded me. I had learned long ago that if I stayed quiet enough, people would eventually talk as though I were not there at all. My brother's fiancée sat directly across from me. She was not the type to dominate the room. Instead, she watched everything carefully. When my parents spoke, she listened without interrupting. When my brother talked about his work, she asked questions that forced him to slow down and explain things more clearly. Her attention seemed focused less on the words themselves and more on the tone behind them. At one point, my father joked about how different my path had been compared with my brother's. The table responded with polite laughter. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the feeling that came whenever my life was turned into a story someone else controlled. Still, I did not correct him. I did not defend myself. Silence had become my instinct, not because I lacked strength, but because I had grown tired of explaining a life that no one seemed interested in understanding. What no one sitting at that table realized was that this dinner meant more to me than it appeared. For them, it was simply a celebration. For me, it had quietly become a test. I wanted to see how long I could remain in a room that seemed designed to exclude me, and what might happen if someone finally noticed the cracks beneath the perfect image my family liked to present. In every conversation about success, my name always came last. It was never announced with pride or celebrated. Instead, it appeared like a small footnote that no one expected anyone to read. That evening at the restaurant was not new. It was simply louder. While my brother spoke about his plans for the future, my parents leaned forward eagerly, nodding at nearly every sentence. My father added extra commentary, turning ordinary accomplishments into impressive achievements. My mother smiled warmly, clearly believing she was presenting a flawless picture of her family to the people around us. From time to time, one of them glanced briefly toward me, just long enough to remind me that I was technically still part of the scene, even if only barely. Their voices pulled my thoughts backward. A few months earlier I had opened my phone and seen photos posted online from a gathering at my parents' house. It had been some kind of networking evening. Drinks were arranged across the patio. People wearing tailored jackets stood near the pool laughing together. I had not been invited. Later, when I asked my mother about it, she sounded surprised that I had even noticed. She explained that the event had been very technical, and that she had not wanted me to feel uncomfortable, as if being excluded had somehow been a kindness. Then there had been the holiday barbecue. The afternoon had been hot, filled with the smell of charcoal and grilled food. Paper plates bent slightly under the weight of everything piled onto them. I had been speaking with someone near the fence when my father's voice rose above the music playing in the yard. He was praising my brother again, talking about the business and about the family legacy. Then he laughed and mentioned me. Not with pride but with amusement. People nearby smiled awkwardly. One person even patted my arm in a sympathetic way, as though I had lost something important and everyone there understood it. Back at the engagement dinner, my brother lifted his glass and commented that not everyone chose the traditional route in life. His tone sounded casual, like a simple observation, but his eyes shifted briefly toward me. A reminder. A line quietly drawn. I felt the familiar pressure building behind my ribs, the urge to speak up and correct the version of the story being told about me. I wanted to say something sharp enough to stop them. Instead, I inhaled slowly and folded my hands tighter together. I had learned that reacting only gave them more power. Silence at least still belonged to me. The worst part was not the jokes. It was the offers. Before the engagement dinner, my brother had called me one evening. His voice had been soft and careful, almost concerned. He asked whether I might need help buying something appropriate to wear to the event, because he did not want me to feel embarrassed. The meaning behind the offer was obvious. In his mind, I was the problem that needed to be managed. At the table, my mother leaned closer to my brother's fiancée and began speaking about my future, as though it were an unresolved inconvenience that still needed to be solved. She spoke about stability, about how one day someone would step in and take care of me. Her hand rested on my shoulder, gentle in pressure but carrying ownership. That was when something inside me shifted. I did not raise my eyes immediately. Instead, I focused on my heartbeat, steady and controlled. I thought about all those nights I worked alone, all the calls I could never explain, all the decisions I made without asking for anyone's permission. They believed my silence meant uncertainty. They assumed my patience meant dependence. Across the table, my brother's fiancée had stopped smiling. She was not casually observing anymore. She was watching closely. And for the first time that night, I felt clearly that the version of me they had been presenting was beginning to lose space. When my mother's hand lingered on my shoulder a little too long, I did not react. When my brother nodded as though my future had been neatly settled, I did not look at him. On the outside, I remained calm and agreeable. Inside, something firm locked into place. The truth was simple. My life had never been as uncertain as they imagined, just did not resemble theirs. While my parents hosted dinners and spoke loudly about growth and reputation, my time followed a different rhythm. Early mornings faded into late nights. My apartment remained quiet, broken only by the hum of my laptop fan and the occasional vibration of a call from another time zone. I measured progress through small confirmations, signed contracts, cleared payments, brief messages confirming that we were moving forward with the next step. There was no applause and no audience, only steady movement. I did not speak about it, not because I felt ashamed, but because I was not free to do so. The work required discretion. The agreements were still delicate. One careless word could undo months of preparation. So when my family offered financial advice or suggestions for improvement, I smiled and declined. It was safer to let them underestimate me than to correct them. That evening in the restaurant, as the conversation moved around me, I realized how deeply they had mistaken restraint for weakness. They saw my rented apartment as proof of failure. They looked at my simple clothes and called it surrender. What they did not see was the discipline required to live quietly while building something that could not survive distraction. My brother leaned back in his chair, satisfied. My father ordered another round of drinks. My mother discussed future holidays, already deciding where everyone would sit. They were comfortable, certain. I sensed the change before anyone spoke it aloud. Across the table, My brother's fiancée had stopped participating in the stories. Her eyes kept returning to me, thoughtful and focused. She was no longer listening to the words. She was watching the pauses, noticing the moments when I chose not to speak, observing how I did not rush to defend myself. I had seen that look before during professional calls, when someone realized their assumptions had been wrong. For the first time all evening, I allowed myself a deeper breath. Not because I expected rescue, not because I needed validation, but because I understood something they did not. Control does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Dinner continued, yet the balance had already shifted. My parents kept talking, still performing. My brother remained confident, but a quiet tension began stretching beneath the surface, like a wire pulled too tight. I stayed in my seat. I remained silent, not because I had nowhere else to be, but because I knew exactly when standing would matter. The server returned with another round, placing the glasses carefully on the table, unaware that the atmosphere had changed. My father lifted his glass first, eager to reclaim the room. With a wide smile, he offered a toast, saying that this was to family and to new beginnings worth celebrating together. Everyone repeated his words except for me. I raised my glass a moment later, just enough not to stand apart. I had learned to survive situations like this by staying slightly behind the rhythm. My brother began another story about his plans, describing a larger house, greater responsibilities, and a future he saw growing bigger by the year. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had rarely been questioned. My parents added to his narrative, interrupting one another to refine each sentence until it sounded polished. Then my father gestured toward me as if remembering something he had almost forgotten. He remarked that I had always been independent. The pause before that word was deliberate. My mother laughed softly and added that I preferred doing things my own way, speaking as though it were a stubborn habit they expected to fade with time. She continued by saying that they only wanted me to feel secure because the world could be harsh and unforgiving. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to make myself smaller. I kept my eyes on the table, tracing the grain of the wood and the faint scratch near my plate, searching for something solid. Across from me, my brother's fiancée did not look away. She tilted her head slightly, as though a realization had just formed. Calmly, she asked me to explain what I actually did for work. The question carried weight. It was neither casual nor polite filler. It was direct. Before I could respond, my brother let out a short laugh and explained quickly that my work was complicated, something technical that I had been experimenting with. My father nodded and added that many people tried those kinds of ventures and that it was a difficult field to succeed in. Heat rose in my neck, but I remained quiet. The fiancée did not smile. She asked what type of platform it was, keeping her eyes on me. The table fell silent in a way that felt unfamiliar. My parents shifted in their seats. My brother cleared his throat. My mother touched my arm again and explained that I was modest and preferred not to discuss my work publicly. That was when the fiancée leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to shift the tone without creating secrecy. She asked me directly whether it was related to logistics. For the first time in several minutes, I lifted my eyes and answered that it was. My voice remained calm and steady. Her eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly, and she asked whether it operated on a global scale. I nodded in confirmation. My brother laughed again, louder than necessary, and remarked that this was exactly what he meant, that my answers were too vague to understand. She ignored him completely. Her attention sharpened, professional now, as she asked whether the focus was supply chain optimization. I felt my pulse slow as I confirmed that it was indeed centered on that area. The silence grew heavier. She exhaled slowly, still holding my gaze, and began to speak before stopping herself in the middle of a sentence. The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped. Glasses froze halfway to mouths. Even the server a few tables away seemed to pause. It felt as though the entire room had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. My father frowned and asked what was going on, irritation beginning to show in his voice. The fiancée straightened in her chair and carefully said my full name, asking whether I was the founder. No one else spoke. I met her eyes and gave a small nod. My brother made a sound that was not quite laughter and not quite disbelief, and he demanded to know the founder of what exactly. She did not respond to him. Instead, she reached into her bag, removed her phone, and tapped the screen with practiced precision. When she turned it toward us, the headline filled the space between our plates. It was an industry article. There were no photographs of me, only analysis, figures, and quotes from investors praising a founder who preferred to remain out of the spotlight. She placed the phone at the center of the table and explained evenly that the platform shown there was currently one of the most closely watched in the sector. She described it as a quiet launch with strong early traction and expanding international reach. My father leaned forward, squinting at the screen. My mother's smile disappeared completely. She continued by saying that her firm had been attempting to secure a meeting for months, noting that there had been no press appearances, no interviews, only consistent results. My brother shook his head and began to object, insisting that this could not be correct, but he stopped when he realized that no one at the table was paying attention to him anymore. She finally turned her gaze toward him. "You said you wanted me to meet visionaries," she said. Her tone was not sharp or mocking. It was controlled, which made it heavier. I honestly did not expect to discover that one of them was already sitting across from me. The room did not move. My mother's hand slipped from my shoulder as if the contact had suddenly burned her. Her mouth opened once, then closed. She tried again to speak, but nothing came out. My father straightened in his chair, the color draining from his face. He asked why I had never told them, and the edge that usually sharpened his voice was dulled by confusion. I did not respond immediately. I lifted my glass, took a measured sip, and placed it back down with care. "You never actually asked me about it," I replied evenly. My brother pushed his chair back so abruptly that it scraped loudly across the floor. He declared that the entire situation was absurd and insisted that if any of it were true, the family would have known already. The fiancée glanced back at her phone and answered calmly that the entire strategy had depended on them not knowing. Something shifted in my brother's face. It was no longer anger. It was fear. Around us, the muted hum of the restaurant slowly returned, yet our table felt sealed off, as though surrounded by glass. Nearby diners were staring now, whispering quietly. I felt strangely detached, steady in a way I had not anticipated. "I did not hide it to prove anything to anyone," I said, keeping my voice level. "I kept it private because I did not need anyone's approval." My father swallowed hard. My mother stared at the tablecloth, her fingers clenched tightly together. I stood up, smoothing my napkin before placing it carefully beside my plate. The gesture felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. "I think it would be best if I left now," I said, turning briefly toward the fiancée. "It was truly a pleasure meeting you," she replied with a single respectful nod. I did not look back at my family. I did not need to. As I walked out of the private room, silence followed me. Not the familiar silence of dismissal or indifference. This one was different. It was heavy. It was uncomfortable. It had weight. Behind me no one spoke, and for the first time in my life that silence felt like justice. I did not hurry when I stepped out of the restaurant. The night air felt cooler than expected, brushing against my skin like a reset. I walked an entire block before stopping, letting the distant noise fade. My phone buzzed once in my hand, but I chose not to look at it. For years, I had imagined a moment like this ending with raised voices or dramatic apologies. Instead, it ended in stillness. Somehow, that absence of noise felt heavier than any argument could have. In the days that followed, the silence remained. There were no family group messages. No carefully crafted texts pretending nothing had happened. When my mother eventually called, her voice lacked its usual certainty. She asked questions that sounded less like curiosity and more like attempts to regain control. I answered politely and briefly. I did not fill in the spaces for her anymore. My brother never contacted me. Later, I heard through someone else that the engagement dinner became awkward when retold. The story adjusted carefully to preserve pride. I allowed it to be rewritten. I did not need recognition. What I needed was distance. What surprised me most was how light everything felt once I stopped carrying their expectations. My work continued as it always had. Calls were taken. Decisions were made. Progress moved forward. Nothing shifted there. What changed was the quiet inside me. The constant bracing disappeared. The urge to prove myself to people who had already defined me faded. I realized then that resolution does not always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like clarity. It looks like understanding exactly where you end and where other people's opinions begin. I did not lose my family that night. I lost the version of myself that kept shrinking to fit inside their narrow framing. And I did not miss her at all. I once believed that being fully accepted by my family would finally make me whole. Now I understand that knowing myself mattered more than earning a place at their table. That night did not transform me into someone new. It simply revealed who I had been all along. If you have ever been underestimated by the very people who were meant to understand you best, know that you are not alone. Share where you are listening from and tell me what helped you hold your ground. And if stories like this resonate with you, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss the next one.